12 hours to collapse. 8 a.m. Austin, Texas, Ground Zero. President James Hawthorne sat in the Pentagon watching live footage from Austin, Texas. The local news showed disturbing scenes. People collapsing in the streets, then rising moments later with lifeless, cloudy eyes, attacking anyone nearby. "This is where it starts," whispered Emily Weaver, his chief of staff. "Austin's hospitals are already overwhelmed." Frank Mason, the Secretary of Defense, leaned forward. "This isn't contained to Austin, sir. We've received similar reports from Dallas, Houston, and other cities across Texas." The president's brow furrowed. "How is this happening in multiple places at once?" "We don't know yet," Emily replied. "But it's spreading fast. We're also getting early reports from Chicago, Atlanta, and Denver. It's not just Texas anymore." Frank Mason, stone-faced, added, "This isn't a local outbreak. It's nationwide, and it's moving faster than we can respond." 10 a.m. Houston, Texas. A firestorm erupts. 2 hours later, the reports from Houston mirrored Austin's chaos. Military units were dispatched to create a perimeter around the city, but the infected overwhelmed them. Fires broke out across downtown as people tried to flee, only to become victims themselves. President Hawthorne stared at the screen as smoke filled the Houston skyline. "What's our current strategy?" Frank Mason's voice was flat. "The National Guard is trying to secure a quarantine zone, but it's becoming impossible. We've received similar distress calls from Miami, Las Vegas, and Boston. This is a full-scale crisis." Emily interrupted. "Sir, Chicago's O'Hare Airport has been shut down. The infection has hit the city and mass panic is spreading." President Hawthorne rubbed his face, realizing the gravity of the situation. "We're losing entire cities." 12 p.m. Los Angeles and San Francisco, the West Coast falls. By noon, the West Coast faced its own nightmare. Reports confirmed the infection had reached both Los Angeles and San Francisco. "We've lost contact with both cities," Emily said, her voice shaking. "LA and San Francisco are completely overrun." The president's eyes widened. "How did it spread so fast?" Frank Mason replied, "It doesn't matter how it happened now. We need to focus on what's next." As military advisors scrambled to issue evacuation orders and quarantine zones, it became apparent that no place was safe. The infection was no longer confined to individual cities. It was everywhere. Portland, Seattle, and Phoenix had all reported outbreaks. 2 p.m. New York City. Chaos in the streets. By mid-afternoon, the infection had fully engulfed the East Coast. New York City, the country's largest metropolis, was collapsing under the weight of millions trying to escape. The military attempted to contain the outbreak, but as bridges and tunnels were blocked off, the infected breached their defenses. Soon, the streets of Manhattan became a battleground, as civilians fought each other in a desperate attempt to escape. "New York City is in chaos," Emily said, reading from her tablet. "The infected are flooding in from all sides. Law enforcement has completely broken down." The president could only watch in horror as live feeds from Times Square showed throngs of people being overtaken by the relentless infected. Entire blocks were burning, the skyline filling with smoke as the city fell into disarray. "How long before this reaches D.C.?" the president asked. Emily's face turned pale. "We've got less than 6 hours." 5 p.m. Chicago, Illinois, the heartland collapses. By the evening, the infection spread through the Midwest. Chicago, like New York, became a war zone. The National Guard attempted to hold a perimeter around the city, but it was futile. The infected poured through, tearing through Millennium Park and turning the once bustling city into a wasteland. "Mr. President, we've lost control of Chicago," Frank Mason said. and we're getting similar reports from Atlanta, Phoenix, and Detroit. The president slammed his fist on the table. "Damn it, what are we looking at?" Frank Mason grimly replied, "Total collapse. It's happening faster than we can respond." 6:30 p.m., Washington, D.C., defending the Capitol. Washington, D.C. braced for the inevitable. Military forces surrounded the city, but the infected were approaching from all directions. Reports from Philadelphia, Baltimore, and Richmond confirmed the outbreak had spread to those areas, and it was only a matter of time before it reached the nation's capital. Inside the Pentagon, President Hawthorne, Emily, and Frank Mason monitored the situation, their faces grim as more cities fell. Dallas and Miami had gone dark. Denver was fighting a losing battle, and now the infection had spread to small towns and rural areas, making containment impossible. Suddenly, a young officer burst into the room. "Sir, the infection has breached the city perimeter. We have infected inside Washington, D.C." Frank Mason barked orders. "We need to secure this room now." 7 p.m., the Pentagon under siege. As the infected descended on D.C., panic gripped the Pentagon. Soldiers stood ready at every entrance, but the first waves of infected broke through the gates with terrifying speed. The hallways of the Pentagon echoed with gunfire and screams as the military tried to hold off the advancing horde. Inside the room, tension mounted. President Hawthorne, Frank, Emily, and a few high-ranking officers gathered around a monitor, watching live updates of the chaos outside. They could hear the distant gunfire through the walls of the Pentagon. "We have to hold this position," Frank said firmly, gripping his rifle. The gunfire grew closer. Then the room fell eerily quiet. For a moment, all they could hear was their own breathing. Emily's fingers trembled as she held her tablet, her eyes flicking to the door. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed down the hall. Another bang, then another, louder and closer. "They're here," one of the officers whispered, his voice cracking. The banging grew more intense, vibrating through the room. Emily stepped back, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. "They're breaking through," Frank said, raising his rifle as he stared at the door. The final thud reverberated through the room and the door burst open. A figure stumbled inside. Its face was twisted, blood covering its gray skin, its eyes lifeless and clouded. It was one of their own, an infected soldier, his uniform soaked in blood, lurching toward them with unnatural speed. "Fire!" Frank shouted, but the infected swarmed in behind the soldier, too many to hold back. The room descended into chaos, gunfire filling the air, but it wasn't enough. The infected overwhelmed them within moments, and the last sounds in the Pentagon were screams that echoed through the now silent halls. 8 p.m. The nation's heart had fallen,